No,
I
don't.
think I can.
No.
Oh,
First session of the Grants Management Training Series. I'm going to turn my camera off, but I just wanted to greet you first and let you know that we're very excited about you participating in this session. It will last approximately an hour. I want to hold the questions for the end, so those of you who don't have questions won't be held up, and you can go ahead and get off at the end of the session. And those of you who do have questions, I'll be around for as long as you need to answer any questions. So you can put your questions in the chat or jot them down, whatever is comfortable for you. So we'll go ahead and get started. Once again, I want to thank you again for joining us for this first session of the Grants Management Training Series. I'm Kalima Amin, and during this series, I'm going to provide you a working knowledge of the grants process from cradle to grave. In other words, from proposal development to the grant closeout. This training will be a series of 4 sessions with the goal of giving you a functional understanding of the grants process. Although this will not result in any type of certification, it's my hope that this will allow you to confidently respond to requests for proposals and contracts. And just to give you a little of my background, I'm currently working as a consultant for International Disaster Relief and Preparedness Corporation. I'm serving in the role of the Senior Grants Officer. In August of last year, I retired from 21 years of federal service. And during that time, I worked in the capacity of a grants management specialist, a contracting officer, as well as a grants policy analyst. During my federal service, I worked with the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the U.S. Department of Commerce, and then finally at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And my program areas were disaster relief, emergency response, bioterrorism, pediatric mental health, live organ donation programs, just to name a few. Typically, when you're in the federal government, they kind of make you a jack of all trades and move you wherever you're needed and give you background and expertise in different areas. Prior to that, I worked in the university arena where I was training faculty and staff in sponsored research activities. So as I said, it's my hope to use all of that information gained to assist in this very important program. So as I mentioned, this is going to be a series of 4 sessions. This is session 1, which will cover the proposal preparation, which includes organizational capacity, researching opportunities, types of funding mechanisms, writing and submitting the grant. And then in session 2, I hope to cover the pre-awards management process. This will include the grant negotiations, the notice of award, project stand-up, and any special requirements by the funding agency. Session 3, which is post-awards management, will cover reporting requirements, amendments, prior approval requests, and site visits. And then finally, in session 4, I'll cover reporting and closeout. And this includes the final reports, equipment disposition, any audit requirements, and records retention. Okay, so let's get started. As I said, we have a lot to cover in a short amount of time. So I'm going to ask you to hold the questions in the chat until the end so we don't have to hold everyone. This is session 1, proposal preparation and submission. And this will include, as I mentioned before, the organizational capacity, finding the best match for your proposal, the funding mechanisms, the proposal development, the budget development, assurances and certifications, the required registrations, and the submission checklist. So as you can see, we have a whole lot to cover, but there are 3 very key steps that must be completed before you even begin to think about writing a grant. And let's face it, you can't skip the prep work and the research that must be done to have a strong proposal. So we want to make sure we cover all of those areas that need to be researched prior to the beginning of writing your proposal. Sorry. So before you get started on writing your grant, you must first research your own organization. And a lot of people don't realize that. You must know the strengths and weaknesses and understand your own needs and the organization's capacity. The organizational capacity can be divided into 5 categories, and each of these categories have multiple subcategories. So the first area of organizational capacity that needs to be assessed is the organization's resources. This consists of the concrete material and tangible resources that support the programs. This includes practice improvements and service delivery programs. This also includes adequate and stable funding, staffing, facilities, and equipment. Your organization's information technology, your informational resources, and your program materials will all be included under these resources, your organizational resources. The next area that you want to make sure you cover is the organizational infrastructure. This relates to the structures and systems within an agency, such as the protocols, your policies, your procedures. This also includes human resources, recruitment and staffing, information systems, and data support and external communications. These are some, but not all, of the aspects of the organization's infrastructure. The next area that you want to cover is your staff expertise and competencies. And it's going to be the very foundation of your proposal. This is going to be what holds it up. You want to gather the resumes of all of your key staff. Now, you don't need to include everyone, not all the staff members, just those that are key to that particular project, the development, implementation, and management of that program. This includes your directors, your administrators, recruitment, your boots on the ground people. These are key people for that particular program. There's no set list of the key staff. As I said, you want to have the key people that are germane to that particular project. So this is where you want to explain your organization's shared beliefs in the next area, culture and climate. Your organization's shared beliefs, their values, and their attitudes that influence the behavior of the organization. This is key because you want to make sure that you understand your organization's culture and that of the funding agency, and that you're going to choose, and make sure that they're compatible. Because, in reality, there's some money out there that you don't want. And it may be that the terms and conditions are not compatible to your organization, or they may have a different type of culture. If you're doing a program, to help people stop smoking, you're not going to the tobacco industry to get money. So you just want to make sure that the culture of the organization matches the culture of the funding agency and vice versa. So this also includes identifying and engaging staff from multiple levels within the agency. And you want to make sure you have agency engagement. And this includes engaging across programs areas to support the practice improvement and program design, as well as the program implementation. So this is how you're going to ensure that you've fully covered your engagement of your staff and your program development team. This is very important because you want to make sure that the funding organization understands that your entire staff is on board and engaged in this program. Okay, there are multiple funding mechanisms for discretionary grants. So the federal agencies review and evaluate the grant applications. In the discretionary grant, the federal agency has the discretion to choose the grantee. These include programs like family violence prevention programs, refugee programs, preschool development, research, transitional housing, and training grants. These all have these are all the types of programs where the funding agency has a discretion to choose the type of program or the type of grantee they want to fund. I'm sorry, I'm having some technical problems on my end. Then you have the non-discretionary programs. These are formula and mandated by law or Congress. So I want to just explain to you the different types of funding mechanisms, because oftentimes a grantee may send an application to an agency and the agency can't do anything with it because it's not in their purview. So it's very important, after you understand your organization's capacity, that you also understand which agencies are funding particular programs. And also the reason that I'm really giving you a broad view across the federal process is because that's probably the most cumbersome process. So we can get that process, down pat and understand that, everything else will be quite easy. So the funding mechanisms for non-discretionary awards, these are programs where the funding agency doesn't have full discretion on who they select to get this pot of money. And this is the same whether it's a federal or state or county organization. Some of those programs include insurance for children, special needs and K through 12 education, transportation, law enforcement, homeland security, nutrition programs for children, programs for women who are pregnant. Poison control centers are one of those types of programs. And so what this means is that there is a mandate by Congress or by law that they must fund a particular subset of the community with these programs. For instance, for special needs. So this money will be set aside for children with special needs, or there could be money set aside just for pregnant women, or money set aside just for children who live in low income areas. So these are non-discretionary. Oftentimes they will come with a formula. For instance, the poison control centers are spread throughout the country. Every state has at least one poison control center. But the poison control centers are based on a formula. It's based on the number of people in that state. And so if you see the Poison Control Center request for proposals, you know exactly how many centers they're going to fund in a state based on the number of residents they have in that state. And so this is what's non-discretionary, because they can't just say, I want to put 5 centers in Florida and 10 centers in Texas. There's actually a formula that goes behind that. You'll also find formulas in other programs for K through 12 education, and it could be based, it doesn't always have to be based on the number of people. Sometimes the formula may be based on the income level of the people in that state or in that county, or the formula can be based on the number of minorities or the number of women, but it's going to be very clear in the notice of funding opportunity what the formula is based on. So there are multiple ways that the federal, state, and county governments provide financial assistance or pay for services. It can be through grants, cooperative agreements, or contracts. And oftentimes people use all of these together and just call it a grant. But there are different types of funding mechanisms and there are different requirements for each. This is another reason why you want to make sure you cover your organizational capacity, because you want to know if your organization needs a grant, a cooperative agreement, or if you need a contract. So the purpose behind the instrument, the funding mechanism, is key to making the distinction between them. The basic foundations of a grant or a cooperative agreement are essentially the same in that they are both a legal agreement outlining a relationship between the funding agency, it could be the federal government or state, local government, or other recipient. The principal purpose of the relationship is to transfer a thing of value that could be the funding, it could be staffing, it could be equipment. So you're transferring this thing of value to carry out a public purpose. And that's the key word, the public purpose. The grant and the cooperative agreement is for the benefit of the public. These are federal funds or state funds or county funds that they're going to give to an organization, but it's going to be for the purpose of serving the public. So the key to grants and cooperative agreements is that they are both for the benefit of the public. So this is how they are similar, but the clear distinction between the grant and the cooperative agreement is the level of involvement by the funding agency. So where a grant, the grantee may act autonomously and they may work their grant from start to finish with very little input from the funding agency, a cooperative agreement requires lots of input from the funding agency. So with a cooperative agreement, there will be substantial involvement by the funding agency. This substantial involvement means that the funding agency will participate in activities with the grantee, such as planning, meeting, strategizing development, and it could be implementation. And the awarding agency will act as a support system and a resource for the grantee when carrying out the activities in the agreement. Now, for first-time organizations, it's always good if you can snag a cooperative agreement because you're going to have input from the funding agency and there's a high level of success because the funding agency is just as invested in the program as you are. Where with a grant, they may leave you to do it they're not going to let you fail, but they're not going to hold your hand through the process. And that's the beauty of the cooperative agreement, where the funding agency is going to hold your hand from start to finish, and you're going to definitely have a successful outcome. So this collaboration is programmatic in nature, and they may provide technical support and subject matter expertise, and they're going to give you this as a grantee. This otherwise would not be available if you were a grant recipient or a subcontractor. So ultimately, the cooperative agreement provides assistance and established relationships between the organizations and the sponsoring agency, in which both parties can collectively pursue the stated activities. And I can give you an example. So most research activities are going to come under a grant. And this is a situation where you're going to receive an award, you're going to conduct research. Now, research is not always something medical or experimental. In the federal and state government, a research activity is any activity where you're going to collect proprietary information. So even if you're doing some type of a survey of people, let's say of people who you're going to collect data on people who tested positive for COVID, technically this is going to go into research if you're collecting any personally identifiable information. These types of activities would typically go under a grant because the federal government or state government is going to award a grantee money to do this work independently, and they're going to collect the results, or they may, pull back that information for the research. With a cooperative agreement, it may be something more along the lines of, a daycare program where they're going to fund the daycare program. They're going to come in and help you build up your infrastructure, make sure you have, technical support. They may even bring in expertise that have, expertise in child development, or subject matter expert in child nutrition, and they may bring those people in and have them at your disposal. And this is the difference between a grant and a cooperative agreement. The third area is the contract. So we've already established that the grant and the cooperative agreement are for the benefit of the public. The contract is for the benefit of the funding organization, whether it's federal or state or local. It's going to be work that they can't readily do. And they're going to issue a contract to a business to complete this work. For example, for the Centers for Disease Control, they issue contracts for vaccines, which we clearly have been talking about this a lot lately. Well, they're not going to actually manufacture the vaccines. They're going to contract with other people like Pfizer and Moderna and all these other people to contract, they're going to contract them to develop these vaccines. And so that's the difference between the contract, the grant, and the cooperative agreement. Oftentimes people don't think about getting a contract, but they come and say, oh, I want to make some money. I have this idea. You're not really going to make a lot of money from a grant and a cooperative agreement. The reason is you're not going to profit from something that's supposed to be for the benefit of the public. But with the contract is where you can actually make money. The funding agency, if they issue you a contract, they're not going to ask you, oh, what are you going to pay your executive staff? What is the director going to make? We're going to put a cap on that. What are you going to pay for this nail or this, this vial of whatever the vaccine may be? They're not interested in that. They're only interested in the final results and the outcome. You can pay however you want to pay. However, you must produce the deliverable at the end. And that's why the contract is a little bit more profitable if you're looking to sell your services to the state, the federal, or local government. So the next thing you want to do, you have completed your review of your organizational capacity. You determine what type of funding you want, a grant, a cooperative agreement, or a contract. And so now you need to determine where you want to, from whom you want to get those funds. And so you have the three main avenues is the state, federal, and corporate. And so grants can be awarded from a variety of places. And most programs for public service will first seek out the federal and state governments as their main source of funding. Understanding the difference between the funding sources will allow you to properly plan your grant search to have a targeted plan. You don't want to shoot in the dark at everything that's moving. You want to have a clear target. So remember, because you're on a hunt, but you don't want to just randomly send out proposals. When I was working at the Department of Health and Human Services, I received a great proposal for a children's book, for African-American children's book. There was absolutely nothing I could do with it. I was working organ transplant programs. And I don't know why they sent that to me. It was a wonderful proposal. It was a beautiful book. Absolutely nothing that I could do with it. This is an example of them not doing their homework, because had they even pulled up my name, they would have seen what programs I was working on, and they sent it to Health and Human Services and not to the Department of Education. So this is what I'm saying about making sure you have a target, making sure you do your homework on your own organization, as well as on the funding organization. So state grants can come directly from your state government's revenue, or they will. And sometimes there's more funding options available actually with the state government than with the federal government. So you want to keep in mind that each state manages its funding differently, and there are state grants available to cover educational expenses, city projects, and a host of other things, transportation and so forth. So state funds are only for programs that would be operated in that state. So essentially, the key difference between the federal and state grant is the source, but both types of grants benefit the public, and they're meant for individuals and organizations in financial need. So generally, you don't need to repay government grants, which is why they're ideal for individuals and small businesses. But for the contracts that I spoke about, if you don't provide the deliverable, there is a chance that you will have to repay those funds. So that's another big difference between the grant and cooperative agreement and then the contract. And so, as you know, for federal grants, they provide partial or complete funding to individuals or institutions and organizations, and they're divided into two general categories. You have the direct, and then you have the pass-through. The direct grants ensure the recipients receive their funding directly from the federal government, and pass-through might go through another entity. They may go through a large conglomerate of a consortium of educational institutions, or it might flow through the state government or the local government or the county government, and then they'll issue those funds out to nonprofit organizations, and that's called the pass-through. But typically the federal government wants to do direct funding. They want to give the money directly to the grantee who's going to actually do the work. So if you're going to look for state, federal, corporate grants, it doesn't matter which ones you're going to look for. You want to make sure you complete all of your required registrations for any of them and all of them. For the federal government, there's 3 places you have to register. You have to register in DUNS, it's Duns and Bradstreet, it's a universal numbering system. You have to register in SAM.gov, and you also want to register with grants.gov. Grants.gov is the central repository for all federal grants. If you go to a website and you see federal grant money and it's not linked to grants.gov, it's likely a scam. So you want to make sure that you do your research and homework on any funding organization to make sure you're not getting taken in by a scam. Every federal award is going to be in grants.gov. Okay, and so you want to determine where you want to seek funding. There's a host of places to find funding on the internet. And as I said, you want to make sure that the place that you're seeking funding from is actually legitimate. There are lots of imposter websites out there. So you want to check the websites. But after doing all of that, you want to search the web. The state grants, you want to visit your state's official page. Don't visit any page that is not the official page of your state government. This is the best place to find your awards if you're looking for state funding. And then of course I talked about grants.gov, which is the federal grant repository. So some of these organizations like the foundationcenter.org, this is a great place to look for awards. You can put in your information and get notifications for all of these. Even grants.gov, you want to set up your notifications, do your registration, and then you don't have to constantly search. the information will come to you. Grant Gopher is another place that you can search for grants and cooperative agreements. And then the funds for non-governmental organizations. You can also subscribe to newsletters. Philanthropy News Digest is another great place. And then Grant Station. So the Center for Faith-Based Grants and Partnerships, you can find at whitehouse.gov. When President Obama was in office, he created the Center for Faith-Based Grants and Partnerships. The office was closed under the Trump administration. It's been reopened under the Biden administration. So this is definitely a place where you want to seek out grants for nonprofit organizations. And this was created to give faith-based organizations a leg up. So faith-based organizations can apply for federal grants on the same level as other nonprofit organizations. There's no distinction between them. So you want to make sure you determine whether you're actually eligible to apply for and receive a federal award. It's very important because you don't want to get to the end of a very long application to find out you're not eligible, or even submit an application and then find out that you're not eligible. Because if you're not legally eligible for a specific funding opportunity, you would really be wasting a lot of time and money and energy completing the application process when there's no mechanism for them to actually award you the funds. So the first step is to know what type of organization that you represent, or if you're applying as an individual, to make sure that you are actually eligible. So there are many types of organizations generally eligible to apply for funding opportunities in grants.gov, and you have some individual applications in grants.gov, and this is typically going to be something for research or some type of fellowship or things of that nature. Government organizations, state organizations, and county governments have their own eligibility criteria. And then you have city or township governments and special districts. And then you have eligibility criteria for Native American and tribal governments, and then educational institutions as well. So these are all of the different types of eligibility that are typical, but you want to make sure you read the eligibility section entirely before you even begin to complete your application. And it's always a good practice to read the entire application. You don't want to get to page 1 and say, oh, wow, I'm eligible for this. And so let me go ahead and start working on the application. And then you get 2 or 3 weeks down the line. Now you're at, page 10, and you realize you really can't complete the project as intended, or the terms and conditions of the award can't be met from your organization. And sometimes some of those terms and conditions are something as simple as the reporting requirements or audit requirements. And it may be something that's beyond the scope of your organization. So you do want to make sure you read the entire application before you even get started. And this is just more eligibility information, different areas of eligibility for profit. Typically, for-profit organizations are not going to get grants and cooperative agreements because this is a pot of money that's intended for public use and not for you to profit. However, in cases like I described, like the Centers for Disease Control, doing vaccines, these are some of the exceptions to that rule. And small businesses, of course, want to really access the Small Business Administration. And you have individuals and foreign applicants as well. So now that you have completed your homework that included understanding your organizational capacity, the types of funding, and the possible funding sources, you can finally start to target your perfect match. As you see, we haven't started doing any writing yet. We're still doing homework, and these things can't be missed because you don't want to invest a lot of time and energy unless you know that there's a possibility of funding. So you want to look for agencies that match your goals. Do not change your goals to meet the funding opportunity unless it's going to give you the same intended outcome. You don't want to just chase whatever pot of money is out there. You should have your own goals, your objectives, your mission statement. You have a target. So don't get swayed by, oh, there's more money over here. So let me change my goals and objectives so I can get that pot of money. This is not typically going to lead you to a successful outcome. So you want to do your homework by reading through the websites the long-range strategic plans, and the funding priorities of the funding agency. And as I mentioned, you don't want to send a great children's book to someone who's doing organ transplant programs and end up missing an opportunity. Review your organization's urgent needs, as well as a long-range strategic plans to determine your future needs, your capacity, and your past performance to determine what areas are most in need of financial support. So you want to research your compatibility as well. Which funding sources meet your needs? Take a critical look at their priorities, their funding cycles, and their expectations, and ask yourself, can we provide all the required reports? Do we have the infrastructure to support this program? If we don't, will the agency funding be enough to fill those gaps? Because sometimes you may not have these things, but if it's a part of the program for capacity building, then the funding agency is expecting to help you build your infrastructure, build your staff, prepare your program. But if not, then this may not be the proposal for you. And you want to find out, what did they fund in the past? And finally, you want to ask yourself, what are their future priorities? This is very important because you don't want, unless you're just looking for one-year funding, you don't want to wham, bam, thank you, ma'am. You want to make sure that you're going to have ongoing support, or they may be telling you we're only funding for 1 year and you should be able to get yourself, stand up your project and move forward from there. So you want to make sure you understand the requirements and the expectations on both sides. You also want to make sure that you cultivate relationships with the funding agency. Reach out to the project officer, attend any public technical assistance calls, meetings, or webinars, and ask questions to ensure that this is a good fit. You're not trying to only determine if you're a good fit for them. You're also trying to determine if they are a good fit for you. Because remember, I said there's some money out there that you might not want. And again, as I said, read the entire application and make sure the requirements, programmatic, management, and reporting are within the scope and staff capacity. If you're a staff of 2, and then you get to the end of this application and you see they're expecting this extensive reporting, extensive audit process, then this may not be something that you can do with a grant. Maybe a cooperative agreement where the agency is going to help you, but with a grant, it may not be feasible. And finally, you want to make sure you make a good ask. Be sure that your request is in line with the activities that you intend to implement. Asking for too much or too little is a big red flag that you have not done your homework and could impact the success of the project. Oftentimes people think, well, if I just ask for a little bit, I can just get a little bit of the pot, what's in the pot. But this is not the case. You don't want to ask for $50,000 to implement a $100,000 program. This is a big red flag, and it's an indication that the program is not going to be successful. And conversely, you don't want to ask for $100,000 to run a $50,000 program. You want to do your homework almost down to the penny if you can, because you want to be able to justify every dollar that you request. And you want to be able to prove to them that you're going to be a good steward of those dollars and that you're not going to splurge, or you're not going to constantly have to come back and ask for more money because you didn't know the capacity of the program. Then sometimes this can happen, but you have to have a reasonable justification to go back and get more money when they've already given you the pot. Okay, so now that we've done all of that, we are ready to write. And we want to make sure that our goals are specific, clear, and concise, that they have measurable and clear deliverables, and that they have an attainable, realistic budget, and that they are relevant and aligned with the values with your overall mission. And last but not least, that you have long-term goals that are time-based with realistic dates, that allow you to prioritize your time and complete the program milestones and the final completion by the scheduled time allowed. So this slide is so important that I have it in part 2, part 3, part 4, and the entire process is built around this particular slide. It's probably the most important slide of the entire series, because even when you get awarded, and the funding agency has questions, and we'll talk about that in training number 2. If they have questions about your program, this is where the rubber meets the road. The questions are going to be around these things, if they have any, and you're going to have to justify the information that you provided. You're going to have to be able to tell them how you meet this criteria. So this is probably the most important slide of all 4 trainings. And I have this slide on every session. Okay, so now when it comes to the proposal development, you want to make sure that you define the organizational need and state the problem. You have to be clear about what your particular problem is and what is your current state of affairs as an organization or as a community, as a county, as a state, whoever you're representing, a nonprofit organization. What is your current state of affairs? You have to be able to clearly articulate that. What have you accomplished towards solving your problem? You just can't throw the problem out on the table and say, hey, funding agency, I want you to give me some money. I want you to solve it. No, you have to have the problem and you have to show what you have done so far towards solving that problem. Because really, even if you don't have funding, if you have the problem, there are some things you can do to start the process. Even if you develop a think tank, a work group, you have a group of concerned citizens that are meeting around this problem, trying to determine if they even have, time and expertise that they can dedicate, free of charge. This is how you can show the agency, we have this problem in our community. We need the funding, but we're already working hard here. We just need you to help us out. So you want to propose solutions and how you will address these problems. You want to show that you have a timeline and a budget, a detailed and specific timeline that coincides with the budget request. Remember, don't ask for too much and don't ask for too little. Do your homework. Do not ask for $1 million to implement a $500,000 project. And as I said before, don't do the reverse, because both are equally problematic and will be a huge red flag to the funding agency. So you want to state the consequences of not getting funded. Clearly articulate what would be the negative impact on your community, on your organization, if you don't get these funds. They have to see that they're going to be able to assist you. And then you want to make sure that you have all of your supporting documents. Label all of your supporting documents. Don't send the reviewer on a scavenger hunt. Clearly label all of your letters of support, your 501c3, your key personnel, your indirect cost rate agreements. We'll talk more about that. Don't make the reviewer go on a mad hunt looking for documents. I don't know how many times I had to review a grant proposal and I'm frustrated because not only am I searching for documents, not on paper anymore, but online, I'm also trying to add things up because this column is not adding up properly, and that you say you're going to spend, $10,000 on laptops, and I don't see $10,000 worth of laptops in your narrative. Don't make me go on a wild goose chase and frustrate the very person that you need to help you. Last but not least, edit, and then edit some more. Have at least 2 other readers. Be meticulous. Avoid passive voice. Use strong, direct language. Make sure you use your spell check and your own eagle eye, because spell check does not catch everything, especially when it comes to a budget. You can't always depend on the Excel spreadsheet, especially if the formula was in error and now the numbers just don't add up. So get a reader also who's not familiar with your program. If you do that, someone who's totally unfamiliar with it, if they can't read your proposal and determine what your problem is, how you plan to solve it, how much money you need, and how soon you're going to have it done, if they can't answer those 4 questions, then you need to start again and do some more work. Okay, so when we get to writing the proposal, the budget is really going to be the nuts and bolts of the proposal. And you want to make sure this is just a sample budget, a budget narrative actually. And you want to make sure that everything adds up, going across and going down, because unfortunately, a couple of the biggest mistakes people make when putting together a budget is leaving out things they discussed in the narrative, but they don't have it on that budget worksheet. And now the reviewer is running back, going back and forth through your proposal, trying to put these things together. So of course, getting the dollar amounts for employees or mileage and costs like that should be easy because you've already done your organizational capacity. You already know how many employees you have, how much travel you intend to take, and how that's going to be charged. You have this information. But when it comes to other costs like materials and supplies, for instance, this may vary from program to program, and you may have to go back and recalculate those things. Make sure you're very meticulous. And I know this seems obvious, but of course, like I said, I can't tell you how many times I've looked at a budget and I'm like, this doesn't add up, and now I'm going back to find out, wait a minute, it's the Excel spreadsheet. Well, that's not my job as the reviewer. I shouldn't have to do that. Make sure you get someone to check those things. And it goes without saying to ensure that the costs you're asking for are allowable. Some funded organizations will have restrictions on the funding. They may have a cap on how much you can pay your executive director. Make sure you haven't exceeded that cap. Exceeding that cap is, in some agencies, an automatic disqualification, and you automatically become ineligible if you've exceeded a cap. Or they may have restrictions on types of supplies or equipment that you can buy, or restrictions on your location. And I remember a program that was in Alaska, and they were working by counties, and one of the organizations was doing service work outside of the county and going into another organization's service area. This was it turned into a really big problem. And it had to send grant specialists and program officers to go down to really act as intermediaries because they were taking people from this wrong service area. So you want to make sure you look at all of the restrictions on budgeting, restrictions on what you can purchase, what type of contracts you can do, even restrictions on your service area, or restrictions if you're doing some type of program that's dealing with substance abuse. The federal government can't give out needles, so you want to make sure you don't violate any of those restrictions, okay? This is just another sample page of the first one I showed you was a budget narrative because it has an explanation. The budget narrative can be all in the narrative form, or it can be a combination of a narrative and a worksheet. This is a sample of a budget, just a simple budget. And as you can see, it has all of the categories down the side. And this is a federal budget, but you can use this for any organization because the categories are typically going to be the same. Basic stuff: personnel, fringe, travel, equipment, supplies. One thing about the equipment, you want to make sure that you find out from the organization what they determine to be equipment and what they determine to be supplies. Back in the day, a laptop was considered equipment. Now it's considered supplies. So you want to make sure you understand from the funding agency. So you want to keep in mind that the budget, again, should be reasonable and shows that the funds being asked for will be used wisely. You will be a good steward of the funds. You want to make sure that the budget is concrete and specific as possible, realistic with estimated costs accurately. You want to break those costs down. It should include a budget narrative that we looked at on the previous slide, and each section of the budget should be in an outline form, listing the line items under major headings and subheadings if applicable. And each of the major components should be subtotal with a grand total at the end. Make sure it adds up going down and make sure it adds up going across. Sounds really simple, but you have no idea how many times that is not the case. You just want to make sure you're meticulous in every aspect of this process. This is another example of the budget narrative. And as I said, it can be in a chart or a narrative form, but remember first and foremost to follow the funding agency's instructions. If they leave it to you to develop the budget, keep it simple. Use the KISS method. If you notice in this budget sample, they have detailed the travel as well as separated the federal and non-federal share of the travel. Don't make the reviewer do the homework for you. Your budget should justify all expenses and be consistent with the program narrative. Make sure after you do your budget, you go back to your program narrative and that you have discussed every category. If you have travel on your budget, there should be a narrative about the travel. Who's going to travel? Where are they traveling? How often will they travel? What will they do when they get there? Are they going to do a site visit? Are they taking training? Are they going to assist, to provide some type of service? It should be detailed in your narrative. The equipment, what type of equipment are you going to purchase? The supplies, who's going to be using these supplies? These are all the things that's going to be detailed in your narrative. If you have new staff that's going to be hired, you want to make additional space and equipment for your staff, this should be clearly spelled out in your narrative, and it should coincide with this spreadsheet here. And remember, the distinction between equipment and supplies for federal, anything with a value of less than $5,000 is considered supplies. It's not equipment. A unit value of less than $5,000. So you want to make sure you put things in the correct category. And then we have the indirect cost rate that is allowed, if it's allowed by the organization. And this is the funds that's allowed for overhead. And you want to make sure that you include those funds as well and pick up every penny that you can. And once you have completed all of those things, you want to make sure you do a submission checklist. You want to make sure you check your deadlines and your submission type, if it's going to be electronic, which is most likely the case, or manual. The only times now that organizations will accept a non-electronic submission if there was some type of issue that on their end, not on your end, not because you were late or that type of thing, or if there was some type of storm or something that can be verified, some type of natural disaster. But for the most part, you're going to submit it electronically. And you want to make sure you review the application to ensure that all the areas have been addressed, and review any required forms. We talked about these forms: your budget, your indirect cost rate agreement, your annual reports, audits, letters of support, your subcontracts. Make sure all of these have been clearly labeled in the proposal. And any special reviews required, if there are any human subjects, again, don't think of human subjects just as some lab experiment, but if you're collecting personally identifiable information from any of your clients or any of the people that you're serving, this includes birthdays, social security numbers. If for some reason you have to have this information, you definitely want to make sure that you're not infringing on any of or missing any of the requirements under the human subjects statutes. Any special equipment and pre-award costs and any waivers. Pre-award costs is something that I did want to discuss because this is something you can request from a funding agency, and you can ask them if you can have pre-award costs if you want to survey land, or if you need to get a building, or maybe if you want to hire a grant writer or something like that. These are costs that are going to occur prior to the beginning of the award. But it's kind of a catch, because if they approve the pre-award costs, it will be at your own expense. If the grant is not awarded, you're going to have to eat those costs. But if the grant is awarded, it will be a part of the grant cost. So this is a little tricky area, but oftentimes you can get pre-award costs included. And then, of course, you want to review all of your required certifications and your assurances, which is all the paperwork in the back that talks about, you won't participate in human trafficking, you won't participate in lobbying or any type of nefarious, activities. And you have to make sure all these forms are signed and certified. And so this brings us to the end of the presentation. I know it might have been quite a bit of information and we moved at a really quick pace, but I'm available for questions now or, in the future. And I definitely thank you for your patience, and I don't want to keep everyone. So for those of you who have questions, I can stay behind. And those of you who do not, I would definitely want to thank you for your time this evening, and just I hope that this was useful for you.
We really appreciate that. You guys can all go ahead and unmute yourselves, and you can go ahead and ask in order. We're just gonna write down the line if anyone have questions. And again, Kalima, we truly appreciate this help as we start to try to move our organization in the right direction in terms of obtaining funding and applying for state, local, and federal grants. Mm-hmm. And again, if anyone has any questions, go ahead and speak freely. All right, we'll give it another 60 seconds. If anyone has any more questions, if anyone has any questions, we'll give another 60 seconds. If not, we'll go ahead and close the chat out. We appreciate everyone who's come on board.
And of course, like I said, it's a lot of information, and sometimes you might not have questions until later. So you can just send an email to Mateen, and he will get it to me, and I will respond as soon as I can. Okay, Mateen, I think that's it.
Okay, yeah, you have a couple of chats there in the group. And again, thank you very much, Kalima. Did you have a question there in the chat?
Oh, for some reason, I couldn't open the chat. This is specifically for grants and not government contracts, correct? Well, we did cover contracts a bit. Contracts it's like apples and oranges. As I mentioned, contracts are for the benefit of the funding organization. And if you want to explore doing contracts, you want to, I guess I could do a separate session on that by itself. I'm not quite sure if you have more specific questions about contracts. So the state and federal and county governments will issue contracts, and you will be required to provide deliverables, where with a grant, when you've received the funding, you have an attendant program. The program may or may not be successful. For a contract, and this is one of the things I do want to say about contracts. You don't have to think of contracts like in the big picture. Let's say, they're doing a contract to build an airplane, hypothetically. Well, if you're a small business, clearly you can't build an airplane. However, you may be able to provide the paint for, to paint Delta on the side, or the stickers or whatever, or you may be able to provide, some type of widget or gadget or whatever the case may be. And so the easiest way, if you're just starting out in contracts, is to find a contractor that's looking for a subcontractor. Most state and federal contracts that are issued, they require them to have a certain number of maybe female contractors, or Black-owned businesses, small businesses. And so if you go and find out where the big contractors are contracting, and you will find that they're issuing requests for subcontractors, this is a great way to get in without having the overhead and not having the responsibility. Because if you're the contractor and you're quote unquote just, painting the wings on this airplane that the ABC Corporation is building, you're only responsible for the wing, and the ABC Corporation is responsible for all of the overhead. They're responsible for all of the legal requirements, all of the statutory requirements. They're carrying that weight. All you're doing is painting Delta on the side of the plane, if that makes sense. So if you're looking to do contracts and it's your first time, it's really a good sweet deal if you can go in as a subcontractor under a larger contractor and just do a piece of the project to get your feet wet, and then go on from there.
All right, does anyone else have any questions, comments, or concerns? All righty. Let me check the chat before I close this out. All right. You have a couple of comments in the chat, Kalima, you can read afterwards. Everyone, Thank you guys all for your time.
Thank
Kalima,
you.
Truly thank you for helping us with this.
You're welcome. Thank you, everyone, for your time.
Thanks.
Bye.
All right, take care. Bye.